been a week since violence broke out between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and what's our president doing about it? Really not a whole lot. While he continues his tour of Asia, he sent Hillary Clinton to do his dirty work. Again, she met with Benjamin Netanyahu earlier today to discuss a potential ceasefire in Gaza. Listen.
President Obama asked me to come to Israel with a very clear message. America's commitment to Israel's security is rock solid and unwavering. That is why we believe it is essential to de-escalate the situation in Gaza.
She clearly wears the pantsuit in the family. I'm sorry, but if the president feels so strongly about sending a message to Israel, why wasn't he there? Clinton's next stop, a meeting with the Palestinian leaders in the West Bank before moving on to Egypt. Meanwhile, the same stream media is doing very little to report accurately on the conflict. Maybe they didn't get the memo that Hamas is an internationally, not just by the United States, recognized terrorist group. Let's take a look at some of the headlines from the week. The New York Times, you know, that big paper of record, quote, Israel airstrike kills 3 generations of Palestinian family, unquote. And this one from CBS, quote, Israel targets Gaza militants, homes sending civilian death toll soaring amid frantic diplomacy, accompanied by this photo. They chose a picture of dead children. Now, over the past week, there have been more than 200 rockets fired and around 130 deaths. But here's the thing about Israel. It's a society made up of a number of different faiths and cultures. There are both Arabs and Christians who sit in high positions of government. Yet, in Egypt, all the Jews and Coptic Christians were banned from the country when the Muslim Brotherhood took over and adopted Sharia law. So why is it only in these Islamic countries that assimilation or even some level of tolerance seems impossible? I'm joined by Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, author of The Battle for the Soul of Islam and the founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and Dan Gaynor, Vice President of Business and Culture for the Media Research Center. Let me start with Dr. Jasser for a second. I was watching a documentary, and I don't remember how long ago it was, on Jewish immigration into the United States and how there was a split within the core of rabbis. Some wanted the people to keep all of their traditions and all of their culture and everything related to the old country. And then there were rabbis who said, look, this is America. If it's not Jewish law, we should scrap it and build a new American Judaism. Is that what is needed here in the United States? Is not a new Islam, but an American Muslim that is different than maybe that in the Middle East, kind of like that show they had about those football players in Dearborn, Michigan.
Well, absolutely, and we need in our Muslim community, our Islamic consciousness, sort of the Americanization process of our faith, which is America was founded on those that escaped theocracy, that wanted individual rights over the collective, over the tribe, that pushed back against theocrats. And part of that was a reform movement, an enlightenment process, and the separation of church and state embodied in our Establishment Clause that really makes America truly pluralistic, and that's why the Jewish community came through this reform also. But I would think they were far ahead of even where the Islamic community is, because our community is being led by theocrats that are still in the 13th and 14th century, that believe that the role of government is to dictate the laws of God over the people and that individual rights aren't preeminent. And that's why my book talks about the American narrative being the lead in my community and my faith and who I am, and that my parents came to America seeking to bring American ideas into our faith, but not seeking to evangelize the Islam of the 13th century that really predominates a lot of what exists in Syria and Egypt, where my family came from.
You know, Dan, I think Dr. Jasser really is a voice of courage, but our own media has fallen in line behind this Hollywood phenomenon where we see people, the BBC even did it. They showed this guy being carried out of what was supposedly an IDF airstrike. Then they showed the very same guy milling about by the ambulances and media reporters in the next clip. He clearly wasn't injured. But here we have, like we showed the CBS photos, we see these pictures that we know are doctored. We know that some of these people are actors. And when the world reports this, no wonder people think that Israel and, by proxy, Jews are to blame for all this.
Well, it goes much further than that. I mean, I looked last week, I looked at all of the reporting of the rocket attacks in 2012, and I've updated it since then. CBS surprisingly stepped away from the pack a little bit and acknowledged that both the United States and Israel call Hamas terrorists. But And apparently Chuck Todd did the same today on NBC. But ABC's got Alex Marquardt out there, and he might as well be wearing a Hamas T-shirt when we're reporting from Gaza. It took them almost, several days into this conflict to even acknowledge that that Israel's fighting a terrorist organization, even though they've been on the terrorist watch list for the United States for 15 years.
Dr. Jasser, how do we get the word out that there's no reason why Jews and Muslims and Christians should be at war over faith? Here in the United States, look, you're never going to get rid of people who say nasty things about one another. That's just the rough and tumble of free speech. But by and large, people have found a way to coexist. In Israel, again, there are going to be people that have nasty things to say. That's the rough and tumble. But there is a free worship. I mean, there are Muslims in the Knesset. How do we get it to the Islamic world that it's best to join? And I don't want to sound like one of these, world community, planet, global citizen types. But how do we get the word out that this is not benefiting anyone?
Well, no reform comes easily, and no reform comes with just political correctness and just sort of going with the strong horse, if you will. And that's been the policy of this administration and the policy of the media, the so-called mainstream media, has been just to sort of go with the strong horses of the Islamist group, the Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups, and lead by what they want us to read. And as a result, it ends up being all about Muslim victimization. Our foreign policy ends up being going towards kowtowing towards the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and the Islamist group and giving Hamas a voice when in fact they're a terrorist group. The Muslim Brotherhood has basically bonded to Hamas. The president of Egypt has repeatedly visited them and recently said things that I found to be just extremely concerning and saying things that are beyond vile and anti-Semitic, and yet we don't counter them, and we need to push back because you're not going to get Muslims globally and domestically to reform and become modern in our thinking and separating mosque and state and pushing back against the collectivism of Islamism and all of these power entities like Hamas and the Brotherhood without being pushed into coming into modernity. Like Netanyahu said to the UN just a few weeks ago, he said this is a conflict between medievalism and modernity. And unless President Obama can start to articulate this, instead of just sort of sending Secretary Clinton, who is on her way out anyway, he's really not showing ideological leadership and really not addressing the core problem across the Middle East and even here in America.
All right, Zuhdi, Dan, stay right there. All right, Hamas is blaming Israel for dragging its feet on a ceasefire, as Al Jazeera reporter Shireen Tadros points out, and I quote, Hamas rocket fire is not responsible to the last missile. It's a reaction to 6 years of siege, bombardment, assassinations, and entrapment. I'm back with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, author of The Battle for the Soul of Islam and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and Dan Gaynor, Vice President of Business and Culture for the Media Research Center. Dan, we are up against a global media that seems to be willing in its bias. I mean, even like I said, with the Bollywood thing, and it's being taught in classrooms right here in America. How can anyone make sense of what's going on with a biased global and national media and an education system that seems bent on not talking about what's really happening?
Well, what I encourage people all the time is if you're a conservative, you have to read lots of different outlets. You have to read conservative outlets, but you really need to see what the left is saying. So, I mean, you need to read the pro-terror outlet, Al Jazeera. You need to see what they're saying. You need to see what BBC is saying. A lot of these global outlets, including CNN, which is very powerful internationally, are giving a picture here of what's going on that makes Israel look bad. And then even our own American outlets. This is what Hamas wants. Hamas is fighting a war here designed to inflame the Arab street. So they're fighting a PR war even on Twitter and Facebook. And the more they succeed, the more Israel will be forced to compromise its security, compromise its integrity, and put its citizens at risk. Americans need to stand up, and this is one of those where everybody watching right now can actually get involved. You can get involved in line, tweeting or posting on Facebook, letting people know about it. But you have to be informed. And if you're just relying on Al Jazeera English and Shireen Tadros, well, then you're getting a biased point where she even said, one of the other things she said was, we are taught to be neutral, impartial, balance. But this is not a balanced conflict, and that's exact, almost exact words that Brian Williams used. He said lopsided. They want Israel to lose just as many people as the Palestinians.
Dr. Jasser, I'm sure there's very few people, I should say, there are few more than you, I should say, that want to separate Hamas from the faith. But where do Muslims, Jews, Christians, or whomever, where do they look to get honest reporting? I mean, where do you look when you want to know what's going on?
Well, you know, that's a great question, and that's why we're trying and to access media, and we often get the hand because they have a narrative that they want to push, which is, as Dan was saying, it's this self-hate, it's this blame America, blame the West, blame Israel for everything, and don't criticize the others. And I'll tell you, as a Muslim and as a conservative, I see this as a bigotry of soft expectations that, oh, the Palestinians don't, you know, they're just going to be run by theocrats, but we expect democracy and freedom from the West, but not from Muslims. And, you know, to look to media, there isn't that many media that we can look at that I go to. I go to the people on the ground, our families in Syria, and others that are realists, that are trying to fight against the strong horse, which is oppressive governments. And really what the media should be demanding of Hamas and of the Palestinians is have an Arab Spring against your oppressors, against the Hamases of the world and the Palestinian leaders that are ruining their lives, leading them by terrorist acts and making their lives into hell. And this isn't Israel to blame. And I think it's time for the narrative to stop the blame the West narrative and move forward and expect Muslims to come to terms with modernity. Because if I can't find for you large media that are saying what I'm saying in the Muslim world. There's El Monitor, there's some Egyptian independent media, but they're not well known and they're not well funded because they're not streaming petrodollars and billions into those. All the money streaming into Islamist media, and the chickens are coming home to roost now with the coalition of all these Islamist influence power mongers now jumping on the anti-Semitic, anti-Western bandwagon.
You know, unfortunately, with or without Israel, Shia and Sunni also end up killing each other, and we don't want to see any more of that either. Zuhdi, Dan, thank you so much for being here.